So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Anton Wiert, and I'm the outsourcing director for Riot Games in Hong Kong. But I am also a member of the XDS advisory committee, just like our next presenter, Mr. Alexander Stein, whom I'm having the great pleasure to introduce. So Alex is the lead artist and outsourcing art manager at Treyarch, an Activision studio based in Santa Monica, California. He has over 20 years of experience in the industry, most recently on Call of Duty Black Ops 4, which is due for release next month. Last year he was actually here delivering a presentation that won an award. So we'll see how he's doing it this time. Because this time he's back with another great talk on a different topic. That is also quite critical. How to best provide feedback. How to communicate effectively. And also like why style of feedback is just as important as the content itself. So without further ado, please help me introduce Alex.
All right, hi XDS. Welcome to Friday. We're almost through it. So I'll be talking a little bit today about feedback tone. It's a little less hard data than some of the presentations. I promise there will not be any KPI talk at all in this one. This topic came up because for those of you who managed to sit through my presentation last year know that at Treyarch, the way we approach external development is we have a team of what we call outsourced coordinators. Right now, that team, including myself, is close to 20 people. And what I was seeing was that while we hired great, these people are all really great. They're artists, they're technical, they actually are very organized, they work between the spaces in the studio to sort of be the glue that holds a lot of stuff together. And by and large, their feedback and written communication has been good. We did see sometimes some tone issues that were not really intentional, not really even that objectionable yet, but I noticed it, and actually some of our partners kind of mentioned it to me, and I thought, we never really talked about this. We talked about sort of the nuts and bolts of what we're doing, but we never talked about sort of these softer skills. And so I put together a quick presentation for them, and then decided it might be something worth exploring a little further for the larger community. For those of you who don't know, every year the XDS Advisory Committee publishes an industry report. It's really valuable, it's very useful. And I was looking at it and I realized that the only issue that appeared from both the service provider side and the developer publisher side in the top 5 list of issues was communication. Some of them do have overlap in other areas, but that stood out to me as well, especially since these days there are more and more ways to communicate, obviously, both written, video conferencing, in-person meetings, all that stuff. For the purposes of this talk, I'm going to be talking mostly about written communication. As another slide in that report, really there's only one spoken communication listed, which was Skype. Everybody else is using Shotgun, Jira, Outlook, Excel, what have you. And poor communication goes beyond hurt feelings or misunderstandings. It actually has real-world consequences to what we're trying to do. And I'll be exploring those a little further. Internally, poor communication can result in actual collapse of some efforts. Not wholesale, but it could actually reaffirm assumptions about external development that were previously held that you're trying to overcome with buy-in. And externally, obviously, it can lead to a lot less engaged partnership. And that's really what we're after. We're after more than just following exactly what we've written or illustrated or asked for. We want our partners to push things. We want them to show us something that we didn't even think of. And when you don't have a strong communication relationship, as I'll explore, you'll start to see less and less of that. I call it the downward spiral. For those of you who were in college in the 90s, that's obviously a music reference, but it's been around longer than that. And simply put, when we start a new partnership, we can expect the first few submissions to not exactly hit our mark. I think that's expected, it's normal. But we should keep in mind that we start partnerships not just at the beginning of a project, or maybe not even at the beginning of working with a single partner. we're starting new initiatives, we're trying new things. Each one of those, we can expect a little bit of ramp-up time, we can expect quality issues. If I go back a couple slides, you can see from the industry report, the #1 issue from the developers and publishers was poor quality, which I find kind of surprising because I think the quality right now with external development is the highest it's ever been, and I was talking with David Lamb about that last night. What happens is, if this persists, you can have reviewers internally who start to get a little bit frustrated, a little bit exasperated. At a certain point, they stop wanting to invest more of their time in what they view as diminishing returns, and the feedback becomes more and more brief, less descriptive, and tonally it can shift. That could have an effect on any artist, not just internally, but also externally. They start to feel a little less adventurous, a little less willing to put themselves out there, and sort of, I've seen a retreat into just, we're going to do A, B, C, and see if that gets an approval. Well, obviously that's not going to be what we're looking for, and it kind of repeats. And it does end up reaffirming this sort of cash out instead of buying in, which is, see, I told you that this doesn't work, and that's a really bad place to be. So where would you say we should break this cycle? You know, you obviously want to improve the artwork, but that's easier said than done. Improving artwork requires some work on the internal team and some communication. So for me, the place to break it is in the review, before the feedback goes out. How do we have the internal conversation that's going to allow that feedback to be a little more useful, a little more inspiring, and break that cycle, continue onward. And the best way to change the feedback, obviously, is to start talking about tone. You still should be giving your notes, you should be asking for what you need. There's just a way of doing so that an approach and an understanding of what you're trying to actually get versus how it's going to make you feel or how frustrated you are. That's important to remind people as in our role as outsource managers, lead artists, whatever we're calling ourselves these days. The internal conversation is a tricky one. I can't imagine everybody here hasn't gone through this a little bit. For artists, internal artists who are less inclined to want to work with external partners, they sometimes look at us as sort of, well, whose side are you on? Well, obviously there's no sides. We're trying to all do the same thing, which is ship a great game. But we are the point of contact, and naturally we are going to have to take on some of that frustration, some of that exasperation that they're feeling. We have to keep that in mind, modulate our own response. That response is important, and this is maybe the most sciencey slide. After this, we're right back to the touchy-feely stuff, don't worry. There is a big difference between compassion and empathy. Empathy, to me, is great for situations in which you can't affect any change, right? Someone's pet has passed away or their marriage or relationship has ended. There's nothing you can really do to fix that problem, but you can be empathetic, you can put yourself in their shoes, and you can be someone who can listen empathetically. Compassion takes some of that, but also allows you the ability to affect a change, and that's really our job. We don't just listen to the complaint, we actually try to address it. This is a little more simpler. This is from a paper I read. It's linked to, empathy is linked to emotion, consciousness, and registering pain. Those are all great things. And it can also be uncomfortable for you as you put yourself in the artist's shoes and then realize you now have to go back to your external partner. You're in sort of an uncomfortable position because you haven't actually addressed the problem with the internal artist, and now you're responsible to somehow fix it. Compassion is a little more cognitive. It's a little more removed. It's, I understand how you feel, but my job is to help us actually fix the problem so you don't feel that way anymore. And it also allows you to sustain yourself a little more because you're actually actively engaged in fixing things, not simply feeling bad. This is all a little esoteric, so I'm going to give some examples. We've all been here, I think. Please know this is not specific to Treyarch. I've been doing this a long, long time in multiple developers and publishers, and none of this is unique to anybody. You'll have an artist say, well, why did they do this? Why did they do X, Y, or Z? And they may throw in some harsher words. An empathetic response is, yeah, you're right. What were they thinking? And that's a great short-term kind of feel-good response. You're on the same page. Maybe that you've bought some trust from your internal artist, but you're obviously not fixing anything. Look for the compassionate response, which is, I understand, I'm frustrated as well, but We didn't hire these guys just on a lark. We tested very carefully. We know they're capable. Let's work together and get them there. Let's figure out what's gone wrong. I'm not going to read through all three of these, but basically it's all sort of the same response on different takes. Internal time estimates are always less, in my experience, than external. That should be a known issue, and if someone's expressing frustration, explain some of the reasons that happens, but also, hey, yeah, let's try to bring them closer. Let's maybe videotape you doing this task and show them how quickly you can do it, and maybe they can mimic that a little bit. The last one, I didn't quite go all the way with this, but I can't be the only one here who has had a lead or an artist come up and say, you know, I don't want to work with this group anymore. I've given the same feedback over and over. They're not getting it. Can we move on? I have a strong reaction to that I have to modulate, which is that why do we have to take any kind of affirmative action like that to actually cut somebody? We're not helping the situation. All we're going to do is transfer the work to someone else who has to ramp up themselves. So I don't know if we gain any time, and then we have to hope that they can hit the quality. And at the same time, we're hurting ourselves because we're taking our pool of resources and shrinking it arbitrarily. I understand it's not working for you, but we're not going to cut anybody because there's other initiatives here who are having success with them or can. And in the meantime, let's get on the phone. Let's see what's going on. If there's a good chance if things have gone this bad that some of it's on our side, and we need to address that for all of our partners. So that's mostly the internal conversation, which I find to be as important, if not more so, than the external. But obviously, external communication is pretty important. I use this image on the right specifically because I evoke this image all the time when speaking to both my team of outsource coordinators and leads and senior artists who are involved in outsourcing. It's important, it seems obvious, but it's easily forgotten that an external partner, especially one that's overseas or a time difference, really only sees that tiny sliver of what we're giving them, just that the smallest amount of information that we had time to put together to send them. And that's just natural. They're not playing the game yet, obviously. They're not, for most of us, they're not walking around the studio seeing what everybody else is doing. They're not involved in design discussions that led to this request. They're just being told, do this one thing, and this is all we can have time to tell you. It's obvious, but we forget it, and sometimes we get results back that don't fit into the larger picture. We have to keep reminding ourselves that look back and see what we actually give them. I always talk about, I wish we had a way, we have a machine at work that we call our external machine, and it's basically white, it's not connected to the network, and occasionally we just run tools and look at packages on that just to see, does everything work when we're sending it to our partners? I wish we could do that mentally. I wish we could somehow put ourselves in a space where we could actually see what they see. Well, we can't, but we have to at least try to imagine it. Finally, we all know there's cultural, language, and time differences. Those are a little more hard to solve all the time, but I'll touch on them briefly. Language and cultural difference are important, and the last part I'll talk about is inequity of partnership. I'll get to that in a minute. Language obviously comes down to translation for the most part. I'm, again, focusing on written for this talk. Translation is less and less important these days. I find that more and more artists at external developers speak English, so I'm a little culturally maybe biased toward English right now. You still should keep it in mind. Frequently, I have partners who have one translator, and they're responsible for distributing notes to the entire team. There's just some hard mechanical choices you can make to make their lives easier and therefore make the external artists more productive. I took one of my less appealing slides and wrote some notes on it in Snagit with the word balloons. That's great, it gets all the communication out there, but if it needs to be translated, it literally needs to be transcribed by hand, typed, and then somehow attached to this and send out to the artist who was responsible for the slide. At Treyarch, we use a PowerPoint template to overcome this. Simple numbers and arrows on the actual artwork. The text is selectable. We actually export as a PDF, but they can select the text. They can paste it below this, translated. The numbers obviously remain the same. We took what could have been a 20-minute task and turned it into a 2-minute task. Feedback goes out faster. The artists are more clear on what's going on. Simple change, big effect. I want to talk about clarity and brevity. I think a lot of times those of us who studied writing in high school and college, we sort of are, and I myself, disciples of Strunk and White, elements of style, which emphasizes over and over and over the importance of brevity, as do some of our more famous writers like Mark Twain. No argument. A strong sentence is generally a short sentence, is generally a more clear sentence. That's not necessarily the case with external communication, especially with such complex efforts that we're making. Context really, really matters. I give some examples here of just a little bit more words that I have to force myself to do because, like I said, I've had brevity pounded into my writing part of my brain since I was 5. Adding a little more text, adding a little more context to what's going on can make all the difference between what's maybe more dictatorial, a little more top-down, to a little more collaborative, and also understanding of why you're being asked to do something. We had a phone call with a partner just Monday night. Yeah, we're working Labor Day, where the partner understood essentially what we were asking them to do, but it was foreign to them because they'd never been asked to do this before. It was just a technical issue with UVs, and they finally came out and said, we're not sure why we're doing this, so we don't know exactly what to do in all situations. And that's when it dawned on us, yeah, we had just been telling them what to do and not why. And every time there was something slightly different than what we asked them to do, they didn't quite understand what it was we were trying to get to. Explaining it takes a little more time, obviously, muddies the water potentially, so you do want to find that balance. You want to avoid uncertainty where you're kind of waffling around a little bit of like, we're not sure what's gone wrong, give it another shot, obviously. We also don't want to over-explain so that it's buried in a whole bunch of talk about what's going on internally with tech. Get to the point, but give them some examples of why it's important. Cultural differences, that's a tricky one. I don't want to dive too far into that. I will say that in my experience, and I'm working with partners all over the world, there is a wide variety of expectations from cultural perspectives of how direct some would prefer feedback and others would like a little more context. My advice would be, remember that you're a representative of your studio. Be as sensitive as you think you would want to be perceived. This is a big one for me. There's been a lot of shift in language lately. We don't use the words vendor as much anymore. We use partner or service provider. I think that's great. I actually agree, and it's something that I sort of enforce internally with my team. We like the word outsourcing, even though it's in the job title sometimes. External development is a little more descriptive of what we're doing. And co-development obviously is a big buzzword these days. And that's great. Those are all great as sort of a way of saying, look, this isn't quite as hierarchical maybe as it used to be, but it still is in some degree. It's not an equal partnership. And I don't say that to be dictatorial, quite the opposite. I think if we ignore that, if we pretend that everything's equal, we actually do ourselves a disservice. You have to keep in mind who you are and what your place is in a relationship when you're speaking to somebody. We talk about that a lot in the workplace in terms of harassment, in terms of managerial style, but I think it's equally important when working with a client or working with a provider. One person is paying the bills, and there's an implied imbalance there. If we decide not to work with you anymore, there's nothing really in most contracts that you can do about that. And I'm not saying that is a threat, but that threat is there. We can't ignore it, and we can't pretend that we're equals, and therefore we can say anything we want to you, and you'll perceive it the way we intended it. We have to remember that when we ask for something, there's an implied or else behind it. We may not want to admit that, but I think it's important to remember. So we like to start with a positive, even if everything in an asset is incorrect. And I want to emphasize, by the way, the whole point of this talk is about feedback, so obviously I'm focusing on things that aren't quite there yet. That's not to say that we're only dealing with negative feedback. There's always things that have gone well. And even on an asset where there's a lot of work that needs to be done, we can recognize how much effort went into it, even if it wasn't exactly in the direction we wanted. Again, contextualize why there's so many notes, why it's so important. We have different tiers of assets at Treyarch. We have what we call hero assets. We have sort of more filler assets. And so when we're going to be looking at something a little more carefully, first of all, we try to indicate that with a priority number. But we also sometimes remind in the notes, hey, you're going to see a lot of notes on this. You're going to see a lot of scrutiny, a lot of maybe nitpicking. That's because this asset is highly important. And when we're done, you'll have something that you guys will be proud of as well. And we may say something true, like, we wouldn't put this with you if we didn't think you could do it. That shows up in process, too. I don't think anybody here who's involved in art is unfamiliar with this process. Generally, for a 3D asset, you do a blockout, a high-res sculpt, which is maybe the most critical stage. It's also the most time-consuming. It's really where the art shines, the artistic talent shines. And then it's back to a little more technical game res and UVs, bakes, and textures. Very frequently, we'll have an asset that gets approved through all those gates until we get to bake, and then that's the first time we're really looking at it in the game engine, and we see stuff that isn't working. And I know from experience that approvals are very, very important to our partners, and rightfully so. That's really their only measure of how much progress they're making. All the feedback in the world is great, but until they're told yes or no, they don't really know whether to move on. And finally, at the end of an asset, that's when they can invoice, generally. So something's gone wrong with the bake, or not wrong, but it doesn't show up in the engine the way we thought it would. There's two ways to approach that. We could simply say the high-res version needs to be resculpted and rebaked. It's a little dictatorial, perhaps. It's clear, it's to the point. Strunk and White would be happy. But what is perception? What went wrong? Wait, you already approved the bake. The sculpt. Remember, you're looking through a keyhole. You don't know that in the game engine it didn't look right. You don't know that whatever thought was approved is no longer approved. All you know is a check mark that was previously checked has been unchecked. Giving a little more context, acknowledging that you approved a previous stage that you're asking for rework on, explaining why, and sort of letting the partner know that it's really nothing that they did right or wrong, it's just that's the situation, it needs to be redone. And of course, making sure they understand the extra days can be billed as long as it's reasonable. It changes the whole thing from potentially dictatorial to collaborative. And I say that in context of what I was saying earlier about the inequity of the partnership. Both of these are fine. You're not saying anything mean. It's not harsh. The tone is fine. But in the option at the top, you maybe forgot the relationship you have and how that can be perceived, and the confusion and maybe sort of bad feelings, honestly, that can result from that. So that's kind of the two sides of the talk that I wanted to give. One was the internal, trying to keep things positive, trying to at least make progress instead of join in the negative side of things. Be direct and provide context and think about the inequity of your partnership. I will take questions if there are any, but I wanted to show what this all... Oh, wait, I'm sorry. This is the final thing. So I showed this slide earlier. This kind of completes the cycle. I won't go through it too detailed, but why do they do this? Don't they develop games over there? How come they don't get this? Giving that same exact response, and then you have to even take the compassion from out of it, be very straightforward and even-keeled about the response to the partner. It's a little different than ours. We prefer you do it this way. 100% different tone from what the internal artist said, but giving the same exact feedback. Same thing down the line. This, I think we'll be distributing these, so I won't read them all to you, but it's just a way of saying, acknowledge the internal frustration, acknowledge that things maybe haven't gone well, steer the conversation internally to a little bit more productive, less dismissive tone, and then yourself take that and then strip it of all emotion and provide enough context to help the external partner understand what's gone right and what's gone wrong. So I have a special treat. This just, I think the kids say, dropped yesterday. It's fire and 100%. So this is Blackout. This is our new Battle Royale mode for Black Ops 4. It's a trailer that we released yesterday. Oh, it's a little adult.
Approaching the drop zone.
and loaded. Good to go. Lighting him up.
Inbound airdrop detected.
You know me. I don't like anyone.
Further collapse expected. Evac to safe zone.
Great. Thanks a lot, everyone.